Let me welcome you to the Transitional Study Group on Transitional Study Group, the Study Group on Transitional Justice, and we try to meet the second and fourth Fridays of the month from at this time, and I'm very pleased that one of our colleagues from the Carr-Ryan Center is speaking today. Felisa Tibbitts has been a fellow here, I think, for a total of 3 years. Yeah. two years under my watch and one time before, and I think that if you were to ask her, what her professional identity is, she would say as a human rights educator, because it's what she spends most of her life doing. But she consults for a number of organizations, the OSCE, probably the Council of Europe, UNESCO, UN agencies, state governments, and she's also the co-founder of a leading organization that does some of the best work in online education courses about human rights education, Human Rights Education Associates, HREA.org, and if you look on their website, they have an enormous number of resources available on their website in many different languages. So it gives me great privilege to introduce Felisa Tibbitts today. And Felisa and I taught a course here for a while, and one session that she taught as a part of transitional justice was who writes the textbooks. Actually, how does that process take place, and how is that negotiated? And so we thought that'd be a great topic for her to talk about today, because she's been engaged in doing that both in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina and more recently Colombia, I believe. Is that right, or is that?
I've been studying it in Colombia.
Right.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Obviously, you have a bit of experience already in transitional justice environments, and perhaps some of you also have been engaged in some of the work that's happened in education sectors in response to and in support of these processes. When I was thinking about what to present today, I didn't know exactly what to expect in terms of your own background in education and education reform. But I did assume that you had a fairly good handle on transitional justice processes and the multiple agendas, sometimes in a way, agendas that can be even in conflict with one another in a sense. So I hope that I have pitched this at just the right level of technicality. I thought that I'm presenting for about half an hour, and that will give us plenty of time to chat, and I can go into greater detail on some of this as well. I think that Charlie asked me to do this presentation, as I began to say, because I had been integrating into our class in our Transitional Justice Day, and it had occurred to me over the years when I was teaching with Charlie, and because my own work has primarily been in transitional justice environments and education reform, that it was something that had been overlooked by at least the literature that I had seen in transitional justice. It had been taken up, like history, education reform, how do you do it? I'd seen it in more educational literature, but not so much in the so-called transitional justice literature. Actually, this came about in part because I went to the ICTJ a couple of years ago and just looked at their names up on the website and asked for a meeting, and 5 people showed up, and I said, why aren't you talking more about education? And we've started to think about it, they said, and as it turns out they were, and they're now working on a project with UNISA to explore how transitional justice and reform is taking place, and there are about 5 of us have been asked to focus on different country cases and different elements of reform. I was asked to look at curriculum in particular because a lot of my own work has been in national curriculum reform, and that's part of the reasons why we have this particular focus. One could also be looking at other changes in the education sector. Now, obviously, the transitional justice agendas, I'm just sort of warming us up here. These are some of the agendas, if you will, thinking about memory, truth, obviously, justice, which relates to the human rights framework. It's not always, as we know, called human rights. It depends on some of the sensitivities. That also pertains for education. A general, broader agenda, of course, of reconstruction of society. And if we think about education more generically, outside of the schooling system, it's obvious that public awareness raising is a part of this, a sort of mechanism for sort of flushing these along. And working them through in some ways. And socialization is a way of thinking about schooling. So a combination of awareness raising and socialization are part of the underlying, if you will, I don't want to say mechanisms because there's a human rights connotation, but they're part of the repertoire, if you will, that states have or societies in general have at their disposal in relation to these agendas and themes. I do want to recognize what I already sort of alluded to, which when we think about these memory, truth, justice, and reconstruction of society, I obviously haven't defined reconstruction of society, but I'll operationalize it in a little bit. These can be these can be actually disconnected or parallel processes. And this is also true for education. We have, just to sort of nod in this direction, you can have more or less emphasis on, for say, example, truth-telling, which would be very different than looking at principles of reconciliation and inclusion. And those could be not necessarily conflicting processes. They might not have actually coming head-to-head in an education system in terms of content of education, but they could very well be parallel processes, and they'd be showing up differently depending on what kind of curriculum is already in place and how it's being transformed, and what actors are active in the school, in the curriculum reform environment, which I'll get to with some examples. Public awareness and schooling efforts are obviously independent ones, and one of the things I have observed in my case study work, I was asked not to look at the work I had done, which was primarily, in Central and Eastern Europe. They wanted, I was asked to look at something outside of Central Eastern Europe because someone else was looking at Bosnia and Herzegovina actually, although I'll bring this example in. So I just looked at South Africa and their reform processes because, as you may know already, human rights was obviously, their constitution was oriented around human rights standards and values, and the Constitution of South Africa was used as a primary document for reform of the education system. At least that was the intention. So it was and it's well documented, and time has passed. And so South Africa was an obvious choice to look at in terms of TJ processes and education reform. And they asked me to actually to look at Colombia, which is actually not a place I have worked in the past. I've been there, I know people, but I haven't actually been actively engaged myself there or studied it. And its transitional justice process is very young, and it's still ongoing. The peace process is still ongoing. So it's very different case examples for different reasons, but it was very interesting to look at them. And one thing I did realize, looking at South Africa and thinking about my own work and the places and the people I've worked with, is that you do have different phases of reform. The first 5 years look different than maybe 10, 15 years later. And that became very apparent in the South Africa case, and I know as I think about my colleagues working in ed reform in post-communist countries, that was true for them as well. So I just want to recognize some of these things moving forward.
I'm going to interrupt for just a moment here to mention them, especially this, what caught my attention was this 10 and 15 year kind of time span, because I think actually we may need to even think longer than that in some ways. In December, I had the privilege of hearing Thomas Bergenthal, who's one of my heroes, give a talk down at NYU. He is a child survivor of 3 different concentration camps, had to go to elementary school in Germany as a Jew, returned to a small community, and then graduated from high school there, came to the U.S., went to college, became a lawyer, is the only American citizen that I know of who has ever served as a judge on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I was very puzzled at how he got that position. One of the reasons I went down to hear him, and it was because President Arias so appreciated his stature as a judge that President Arias made him a citizen of Costa Rica and then nominated him to the court. And then he served for 10 years on the International Court of Justice in The Hague as well. So a very interesting jurist. And in this audience, he was asked, what can we do to prevent another Holocaust? What's the most important thing we can do to prevent another Holocaust? And he said unequivocally, human rights education. And he said Germany is a great example of that. Look where Germany was in 1945 and look where they are today. The process of education in Germany is what's transformed it. And it wasn't the answer I was expecting, but it was a very, very poignant moment when he said that's human rights education is what we can do that's most important.
Great. Yeah, I think that we should feel free to stop and comment as we go along, because the points will go past very quickly. And I thank you for making that point. There wasn't a lot actually available that I could find on Germany when I started work in Central Eastern Europe, by the way, but there has been more documentation coming out even now, and because I think there are political scientists interested in the education sector and political socialization, and that look at the schooling sector. So now I think there are more things out on Germany than there were, as an aside. But I'm very glad to hear that he said that. So just so we don't, before I get into curriculum, I just wanted to recognize, especially for those of you who haven't, perhaps before today, thought about schooling as a whole and its and how it can be oriented towards the agenda of transitional justice societies undergoing transitions like these. There are, sorry, I missed it? Sorry about that. This is very sensitive here. So very often in a transitional justice environment, there's a wider agenda. There's been groups that have been discriminated against, or there have been conflicts, and so democratic inclusion and social cohesion is a very high priority. And so before we get to curriculum, some of the agendas that are out there for education leaders have to do with the integration of schools, breaking out of segregation. If there has been a situation where certain language groups have been isolated because there haven't been learning majority language, then you look at language policies and language learning policies. Curriculum reform is another tool. And just also the very processes of reform themselves. I think especially the last 5 years, my observation has been there's been a lot more sensitivity to also the process themselves, that they're not just sort of top-down, that those groups for whom the policies are especially intended to influence, perhaps vulnerable groups, minority groups, are actually at the table. And also, in conjunction with that I've heard more grassroots-oriented consultations as well, not just sort of key stakeholders coming into an expert group. So these are wider frames for schooling reform that are very, very important and are happening simultaneously. And one of the things I do want to stress, which through the South Africa example I think will become more obvious too, is that these are happening very fast. You have leaders, some of them are new leaders in education, in an environment where you're having to repair and build communities. Again, you have to undo, if you will, some of the damaging policies from an earlier period around language learning or segregation, discrimination. You had situations where populations have literally gone underground to be educated, as the Albanians in Kosovo were for a period of time, or in apartheid South Africa. So you really have a lot of work in front of you. You often have the benefit of donors coming in. Sometimes those donors come in with very fancy, technically sophisticated ideas about ed reform in an environment that's highly compromised in terms of capacities of teachers and even infrastructures. So it's all to say that look at this agenda and think about an environment that's, again, under pressure, and especially the first 5 years really undergoing lots of changes at the same time. It's a very disconcerting time for many. So one of the things I did want to look at for this paper for the ICTJ, which I mentioned to Charlie I'd be happy to make available when it's finalized. I did not assign a reading, but if you're interested after the presentation today to see the paper that I'm working on, just let me know. Give me your email and I'll send it to you, or we post it on the course website and let you know, or the website here for the Carr Center. It'll be done in May, and you might be interested to see that. So one of the things I wanted to look at is what is different in a TJ environment. I mean, curriculum reform is something that's I'm going to be focusing on now, but what about the environment in curriculum reform can we identify as worthy of attention? One, of course, is just that the education system itself is part of a government that's trying to establish legitimacy often. So, and I think that's important when we think about education, because in education sectors, how do you establish legitimacy? You increase access to education, you increase, you try to improve quality of education, not overnight, but over time. And in the case of South Africa in particular, trying to improve the employment of your youth. So, so the political agenda, even though the values of transitional justice may be present and may be very well articulated, educational systems rise and fall on how well they're enrolling, if people are graduating, if they're getting jobs. And those can come in conflict with transitional justice values when there's limited attention or resources for reform. When you literally have to figure out, okay, we can have a new course, we can extend our science, or we can have another civics coursework. These kinds of discussions actually take place. So the political agenda is a broad one. We also have other actors. The obvious ones, of course, are truth commissions and reconciliation agencies. Some of them are involved in public awareness raising, others are not. Some are more closely linked with schooling systems than others. Sometimes every situation is different. But there are actors, and their agenda is to forward transitional justice processes, and they can be more or less closely working with the ministries of education. Sometimes you also have, because it's a process of democratization, you actually have those actual processes also influencing education in terms of new unions, for example, being developed. This creates a very dynamic and more complex environment for curriculum reform. And if you're in the educational sector, you'd recognize this is the case. If you're not, maybe this is one of those moments where it's a little technical. But it is these dimensions of the environment are make it a different environment than the usual curriculum reforms, which are sort of ongoing typically every 4 years. You're looking at textbooks and you're getting new ones out. Another factor that's different, which I've already alluded to, is that you've got money. You know, in transitional justice environments, very typically, at least at the beginning, the first 5-8 years or so, you have donors. And this is important here. This is the intersection now with what I know this year I've been teaching at a teacher's college at Columbia University, and I teach development ed courses. And here you get the neoliberal agenda, and many times funders coming in trying to support certain kinds of education reform oriented towards basically employability. And so the donors may come in with their own ideas, not only about the agenda for reform, but also outcome-based learning, which has become almost standardized now, was not always the case. And when donors come in with a certain agenda, it also creates the opportunity for massive changes, but these changes are sometimes very hard for education systems to accommodate, and I have many examples of that. So I won't go into that unless you're interested. But
I've never heard science and math called a neoliberal agenda.
Yeah, in terms of employability.
It's sort of an old agenda, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, is it really a neoliberal agenda?
Well, it's seen as a neoliberal agenda insofar as you're increasing the numbers of classes for science and math, vocational education, entrepreneurialism, those kinds of applied skills.
STEM.
It's seen as being...
That's the new term, STEM.
Yeah, STEM.
It's the
Yeah,
neoliberal.
STEM, science, technology.
No, I know. I'm just saying. So why does that
It's a
have to
matter
be
of emphasis.
Why does that have to be a neoliberal agenda?
It's seen as a neoliberal agenda because it's seen as associated with the purpose of schooling as related to employment.
Okay. No, I'm saying
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
China is famous for its science and math programs. You don't have to be
Yeah.
neoliberal to support science and math. I'm sorry, just
No, that's right. No, it's-
everything gets called neoliberal these days. I'm just going.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and in the education development field, and it's a fair question, of course, is that the neoliberal agenda is associated with economics and human capital. I mean, that's the jargon. In fact, I mean, in terms of like South Africa, it was literally the South African, the person from the South African Human Rights Commission who was seconded to the Ministry of Education to help infuse HRE, who used this language. So it wasn't language that I myself put on this. But that's how he eventually interpreted the very superficial treatment of human rights that eventually came about despite his work, which I'll get into a little bit. And he specifically said science and math. That was what they were eventually competing against. So again, I think it's just this notion of when there's I mean, of course there is some science and math, so how much more did they want to add? I'm not sure. I mean, was it a matter just of a degree? You know, what happened was they ended up with a transversal infusion of human rights themes as opposed to more new courses in it. So, but just to explain, it's an absolutely fair question, but it's actually a language that was given to me around specifically what happened in South Africa. But I do know from having sat in on with educators interested in to do reform, like in history and so forth, that they, even if they don't feel a direct competition, because history is already established, so you're not trying to make a new course in history, you're just trying to shape it a little bit differently, they know that they as teachers or they as a schooling system are going to be judged on how well students perform on those comparative tests on science and math, and how how easily they're able to find jobs or create jobs, as the case may be. So, in the minds of some, this is really seen as a direct competition because, again, of limited space in the curriculum. Other challenges, of course, are obvious ones like how can an education system be expected to deal with transitional justice issues if it's not resolved in society itself? And this came to play when I was working, as Charlie knows, in Bosnia-Herzegovina around history education, where you really didn't have, a real transitional justice process worked through the courts yet. I mean, with clear identification, totals, agreement on totals of people who were killed or perpetrators who had, had been clearly identified and there was a collective understanding about who was responsible for certain atrocities. Another challenge is the idea of counter-narratives, which is pretty powerful when it comes to teachers, too. In any environment, I would say, where there's been a conflict, teachers have been one way or engaged or another. If it was a conflict of ethnic origin, they are coming from a group. They may have been personally affected by what happened. In the case of South Africa, they may have themselves been, or come to see themselves as being part of a privileged majority. And so there are stories that teachers have, and it's very interesting the first 10 years, I think, following a conflict, especially where you have both teachers and students with memories of the conflict. And now in South Africa, I met with someone recently who said, this is the first cohort of students we have now who have no memory of apartheid, and how interesting that would be for teachers and very different. So this idea of counter-narratives from families and teachers are just important. Those are things you can't control in the schooling system, but unawareness there is, like you may be, even if you would propose a kind of values in school of reconciliation, for example, and inclusiveness in terms of, say, ethnic plurality, there may be very different views about that in the families. If you're working towards a collective history for a conflict, that may not be a history that everyone subscribes to, including the teachers themselves. So these counter narratives are out there as just a reality. Another thing I've also alluded to is the very capacity of teachers themselves. They may have been part of groups that have been discriminated in the past. They may be leaving the country now that they have the chance to do so. If the economic, situation has been compromised, teachers may be doing double jobs, which influences the time they have for schools, or may have decided to leave the profession. So the teacher capacity is really an issue here, and it has to be part of what's considered. But when you think about that and you think about some of the demands that are put on schooling systems and reform environments, it's a kind of never the twain shall meet. Another factor that's become much more obvious now, and I think in Latin America, I think, Leonardo's looked at it because it's part of in many places they're just generally in cultures, but I think in transitional justice environments, there's been some now observation that there's more violence in schools in general because there's just more in society, and that this needs to be addressed. So you can imagine that you're having language about human rights and justice in the schooling systems, and you have rampant violence and teachers feeling like these are the kinds of needs they have that need to be met, and those are most pressing. So again, these don't have to be exact opposites, but that a Ministry of Education paying attention to this helps to ensure that they have continued legitimacy with teachers and also really meet some of the most immediate needs. So I'm now going to get back into curriculum reform, and these are just some very general sort of what can be happening in curriculum reform. I'm going to talk about processes and norms, and then specifically look at history education and infusion of human rights education in a kind of general way. I think I'll be able to wrap this up in about 15 minutes. So one of the first things you do in the schooling system in this kind of environment is you go back and you look and see if there's anything offensive in the textbooks and the curriculum and the standards, the lessons that may have perpetuated the conflict in the first place, because the schools are never neutral. So when you have environments like these, there may well have been, especially in a segregated system, there may have been racism, hate speech, stereotypes. It runs the gamut. So you go back and you remove those. I know in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, right after the changes, when it was too soon to change the textbooks, the teachers told me they were just literally putting little paper clips on the pages where there was Marxism-Leninism, and those were the lessons you skipped, or there are some things you do like right afterwards, and then you eventually, you really often come up with standards for sanitizing, if you will, some of this, again, these offensive teaching and learning materials or courses. Then you have to really more build, and the next step is really identifying concepts and pedagogies to support what I would say democratic consolidation. This is really important. Concepts, of course, are the content, but pedagogies is how you do it, right? And so one of the opportunities that's offered, especially by folks coming in from abroad, to systems that have been more traditional in the way they teach, is just to think about democratic processes in the classroom, so you have more dialogue, that you have more sort of participatory learning. And the idea is, and some of the comparative education studies have also supported this actually, that even just the simple ingredient of dialogue is much more likely to produce more democratic attitudes, plurality of thinking, a kind of disposition about knowledge and views that is associated typically with democratic processes, so that you're moving away from a singular way of thinking about a singular view of history, for example, or singular political ideology. This is seen as supporting a democratic development. So pedagogies that are associated with that, again with dialogue and multiple perspectivities, especially around history, are often presented as supports in a transitional justice process. Many times countries are already doing this, but it's supported more fully. Other kinds of links that can be made that are associated again with these kinds of concepts and pedagogies are, it's called active learning. So you're not just reading from a textbook, rote learning and repeating. Again, focusing on multiple perspectives, using extracurricular activities as ways to get students out in their communities, and really learning more experientially. Not all of this can happen in a typical classroom environment, so this is where you have also NGOs often connecting up with schools and providing these kind of enriching experiences. And then the other thing to keep in mind is as you think about curriculum, but you can also have, by the way, in terms of these elements I have in parentheses here, you can have language in the curriculum reform that recognizes and validates this without the schools necessarily themselves being obligated to do so. They might, for example, have language around emphasizing how important it is to have links with community, or to have outcomes for students that would allow them to be to identify problems and solve problems in their school or community. So they might have some outcomes-oriented goals that would more implicitly encourage teachers or NGOs to be more creative in terms of the teaching and learning processes outside of the classroom. Yeah.
Felisa, what happens in a place where clearly in South Africa, probably everything had to go in terms of textbooks, probably the math, probably everything except science was oriented toward apartheid in a way, but education has to go on, and so those transitions must be pretty difficult when the system is just filled with evidence of the old.
I'm not sure what just happened there. Could you put it on 5? F5? I think we just lost it. There we go. Thanks. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, that's right. There's a lot to change. I mean, again, every system is sort of different. I mean, I know that when, with South Africa, the first 5 years was a bit more chaotic. I mean, also organizing the reforms themselves. You have to integrate the schooling systems. I wasn't part of that process. I became more familiar with it when I was sort of down the road. And actually, we're going to get to the South Africa example and processes, so maybe that we'll come back to it if I haven't answered it. So what I want to do now actually is just go right to some examples of, but I guess what I wanted to say is that it is an undertaking, because curriculum reform is just not new standards. It means elaborating new teaching and learning materials and preparing teachers to also use these materials or new pedagogy. So it's like moving a ship. It's not just, you can't just change one piece of it if you want it to be really, to take root. You really need lots of supports. So it's quite an undertaking. So what I wanted to look at now in the remaining time is some examples of history education reform, and then I'm going to look at human rights education reform in South Africa and try to look it back to what you just asked about, although I'm not sure I can answer all of it. So I wanted to just present some examples from my own research and some of my own work, just to give you an idea about some of the issues out there around history education reform. And this, by the way, is becoming more well researched. So if this interests you, you can find articles, or I can direct you towards them. So I'm not going to give you a comprehensive rendering of all of these because I actually don't know them comprehensively, but I would be happy to share with you some things I've pulled from their own experiences that may be interesting for you. Argentina apparently has been involved in history education reform. I mean, it's been some years now out of dictatorship. And a woman named Ana Maria Rodino, who is originally from Argentina and now teaches there part-time, who is in human rights education. She used to work with IIDH, actually, has been engaged in this, and she studied it. And recently she shared with a group of us that there's a distinction between thinking about history as a collective history versus history more oriented towards social memory. And this is, I think, an important thing to think about, because if you're trying to work towards a collective memory or a collective history, then you really have lots of negotiations to make around that, and it's very difficult to do, I think, right after a conflict as well. So don't think that history education will end up with a single history education. Another alternative is something called social memory, which I had never heard before, frankly, which is more just looking at documentation or testimonials either of local histories, which is sort of what Colombia is doing right now in a very, very early stages of a transitional justice process. There's a place called the National Center for Historical Memory, which is an offshoot of the center that had been commissioned to basically collect documentation of human rights violations. And they wanted to do something with that, and they decided to use those narratives, and they're often just relatives of people who have been killed, narratives to just have a sort of a witnessing of the fact that these killings and these disappearances took place. These testimonials are actually are being used by this National Center for Historical Memory on a pilot basis with teachers in schools. I have no idea how it's going to work. They're literally just pulling together some of these examples now. I have my own opinions about whether that's a wise thing to do when you're still in conflict. But nevertheless, it reflects a social memory approach, which is, again, not looking to have a collective memory per se, an agreement on that, but just to have documentation of testimonies of atrocities that took place and human rights violations. South Africa has actually really focused on pedagogy of history education. Certainly they had to work through how they were going to be presenting apartheid, and there's many people that have written on that. But part of what I took out from my research about their education reform is how much they actually focused on the pedagogy of history education. And it was very interesting. They have, in the South Africa context, many actors pulled together on different commissions and working groups and projects in conjunction with the Ministry of Education to elaborate some reforms. The South Africa History Project was spearheaded by a woman who was a history education teacher trainer, and she was a person of color, and she was working before the changes and then after as well. And she really was spearheading a kind of approach that was looking at multiple perspectives, use of primary documents. She herself had been trained in archaeology and had been using that to try to make a point with her white students that there was a culture in South Africa before there were the presence of Dutch and British settlers. So, but there's a lot of focus on pedagogy. There are organizations, like there's one in Europe called Euroclio, whose raison d'etre is basically the pedagogy of history education. So that, again, it's aligned actually with some of the agendas of transitional justice in terms of there being a more inclusive presentation of groups and individuals in a country. Also, not only looking at political history, but social history, as valid for history. So moving away from a very politicized view of history or approach to history. And then all pedagogy, which is ways of teaching, like the idea again of primary sources, that you look also for individuals in history, not just movements in history. So it's a very well elaborated pedagogy. I treat it as a pedagogy, but but this is there's lots of documentation on this. I can tell you more about it. But they've really embraced pedagogy as a way of influencing history education profoundly. And the South Africa History Project, which was comprised of educators commissioned by the Ministry of Education, elaborated guidelines for this. And it was very interesting in South Africa, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, which I think Tutu was associated with, was responsible for sort of keeping an eye on curriculum reforms to make sure that they were oriented towards reconciliation. And this woman, June Baum was her name, who was in charge of the History Project, when I interviewed her last December, said that basically meant, for example, when they had to pick the history textbook writers, they had to make sure that they didn't have anarchists. They had to make sure that they didn't have radicals. So, so there was the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation was especially linked up with the South Africa History Project. But when it came to human rights education reform, it was the Human Rights Commission that was overseeing that. I thought it was very interesting that in the South African environment you had these TJ actors, basically with a kind of division of labor. Bosnia and Herzegovina, if you know anything about that context, they have different ministries of education, multiple ones. They have their own curriculum. It's not centralized, and it's quite challenging. So actually, I realize now I have something that would be interesting for you to look at. The handout. So if you look at the first handout, the Manual for History Teachers, this is actually taken by a publication developed by the Council of Europe in conjunction with the OSCE. And could we have one here? And this actually gives you an example of the history pedagogy, just to make it concrete here, Charlie. So this is the kind of pedagogy that I just alluded to. This is just one example. I mean, I referenced it in regards to South Africa, but it's really what you're going to get when you're thinking about history education reform. I think it may be something that you were actually raised with, so it's not going to seem unfamiliar to you, but there are places where this kind of history teaching is not traditional. So you can see here, I just have the table of contents as you see. It's the multi-perspectivity, interactive teaching, and you get a little bit of idea of what they're looking at. In this case, good practice, they're looking at different examples of, what that might be, coexistence perhaps. But the appendix is the guidelines for writing and evaluation of history textbooks. I'm still on the top handout. So I was brought into Bosnia and Herzegovina to work with them because they had different ministries of education and history had been so contested, and it had been actually...
And there were actually kind of three, right? It was the Serbian version of things, Bosnian version of things, and then the one that existed.
Yeah, they had the Croatian. Well, they had three different versions, indeed, and it was very challenging. So the guidelines, the Council of Europe had successfully in 2005 actually cobbled together at that time the only educational policy document that all the ministries had agreed on. All of them, and it was guidelines for history textbooks, and they decided to take those guidelines when I was brought in a couple of years ago to see if they could actually turn those into standards for history teaching so that it actually could influence teaching. Because basically the guidelines for history textbooks was this is how you're going to write, this is how we'd like you to write your textbooks, but whether or not it was implemented was unknown. Textbooks obviously should be related to learner outcomes. They're just not standalone, otherwise you might as well just be an NGO, delivering your nice textbooks. They really wanted something the ministries would be actually implementing through the ways that ministries implement curriculum reforms with outcomes, curriculum, textbooks. So they were taking these guidelines. This was, when I came in, it was with the OSCE, but was based on the work of the diplomatic work, really, and the technical work of the Council of Europe, to take those guidelines and to try to transform them into actually ones for teaching history. And you can see the manual. This was the manual the Council of Europe had developed back then, but there's also really guidelines, which I used to reference in our class, which basically talked about you should not refer to those countries beyond our borders in negative ways, unnamed countries on the borders. So, but it was not thinly veiled. It was really basically not to denigrate, because you did have different ministries of education that would have their own views of their neighbors, to try to get rid of some of that negativity. At the same time, working towards this kind of pedagogy that you see an example of right here, both those things together at the same time. So they actually, by the way, I did check for this presentation to see, and they have succeeded in they piloted, they finished them, the standards are out. I'd love to get the backstory on whether it's going to really happen, but they succeeded in getting those outcomes done. And history, I think it happened in history here, partly because there had been so much awareness that history education in that area had contributed to the hostilities. So it was at the first target. And otherwise, they might have tried something else. But by the time I was there, which was just a few years ago, there was a whole cadre of educators in the respective ministries of education that had undergone trainings and this new kind of pedagogy of history education. We weren't starting from scratch at all. So it was just a question of could they create a policy environment where they could really have a kind of history education like this. And again, this was years afterwards, and in a transitional justice environment that's not resolved, not easy. So you saw an example there. Now in Rwanda, just to tell you, there are counterexamples as well. As far as I know, they still don't teach history. Another alternative you have is just to freeze it, not to teach it at all, because it's so contested, because it is a process to work through it. And especially if you're trying to work through collective history. So that's always an option there. So I'm going to move now on to human rights education reform. Is there any questions or comments on history ed? Because some of you may have experience.
I'm very interested in this dichotomy that you're presenting, collective history and social memory. And I did read something about the Argentinian trials and how that worked out to shape these two elements of the Argentina social identity. But I was also thinking of ICTOI prosecutions, basically. So the question is whether if you have any insights on what is happening in Serbia and whether they're teaching history there, because as far as I am aware, their version of ICTY prosecutions and who Mladic and Karadzic and so on and so forth is a different, very different version than the rest of the Balkans. So I was just wondering, since you said Rwanda being so contested, history is not being taught, if you had any insights in Serbia.
I don't have any. I have no knowledge of what's happening in Serbia, but I guess given what I've heard about there are Serbian enclaves like in Kosovo and Mitrovica, they are using Serbian textbooks. I wouldn't be surprised to know that's the case, but I don't have any direct information about it. Sorry. And I've never been, I don't know anybody working in history education reform in Serbia, which perhaps is telling as well.
Part of the problem.
To be honest with you, it's none of the usual suspects. But if you're interested, I could try to find out. I do know civic education activists there. There are really good civic education groups there. So I know there are some. I also know the last time I was working there that it was hard. It was very much dependent on who was the Minister of Education. And when I was there last, actually with the Council of Europe, it was a good environment for those kinds of changes. But I know it's been changing politically there. So, but if you are interested, I can try to find out. Just let me know.
Thank you.
Any other comments on history education or experiences you'd like to share? I've been standing delivering. I just have one more. I'm going to be moving here to human rights education. So, all right, hands up. Please go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering how this process would play out any differently in settings that don't have a strong centralized government. I know that Iraq has had a couple of tries at revising their history curriculum, but it's never really gone over that well. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the ways that might affect the process.
Well, you're right. You're pointing out that history education reform it's contingent on this, the organization of education in general and how centralized or decentralized. In fact, it's the case. That's why Bosnia-Herzegovina has been a challenge because it's deliberate. It's like a pillar system. Other challenges you have, like Colombia will have, but it can be seen as an opportunity, is that it's decentralized. Decentralized in education means that there are policy decisions that it's not bifurcated like you have in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but you have a kind of way of organizing curriculum so that only certain decisions are taken by the Ministry of Education in the center. You leave it to the directorates or the districts or provinces to make other decisions. So in Colombia, it's actually even to the school level. There's a lot of freedom given to headmasters, principals, and their teachers about which courses they're going to teach. They can't do willy-nilly teach anything, but there's a lot of choice. So that's another scenario where what you can then have perhaps are just sort of general guidelines, but left to the discretion of the headmasters and the teachers. Then you have to have another way of working, which is to be persuasive that this would be a good idea to teach this way or to offer this class. And I know quite a bit actually about Colombia's civic education competencies, because those I've studied. And they're, as it turns out, not really related to the TJ processes, interestingly enough. They were started 5 or 6 years ago to try to bring down the violence in schools. So it's their civic education competencies are more like a kind of trying to reduce interpersonal conflict. But they have had a real trial with that, because they have these terrific, and I mean they're fabulous competencies for civic education in Colombia, and hardly any implementation because the system is decentralized. And so there, yeah, absolutely. If you were to study this, you would, yeah. So that's right. That you can't wave a magic wand, and you have to work with the system that you have there. I'm not familiar with the Iraq situation, so if you'd like to share more, feel free. But it sounds, I can understand that would be a challenge. So is it decentralized? Is that the case, or is it segregated, like as in Bosnia-Herzegovina?
I think it's more that it's decentralized, and also they just have such a situation of political deadlock that when they have had new curriculum put forward, it's never really been able to be fully implemented.
Is it because of resistance to the Ministry of Education? Would you say part of it? That also
I think that
happens.
would be part of it, and also because the Ministry of Education is part of the government of that, which is not fully recognized by
Right, so
everyone.
the legitimacy is
it's been
questioned.
So many years.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. You know, these are all factors. I mean, you think about transitional justice processes in general. I began with one of the agendas is to establish legitimacy, and if you don't have it, it impedes any kind of reforms, whether you're in the education ministry or anywhere else. So, but thank you for that question, because it's also allowed us to go a little bit more into context here in the country in general, but in the education systems. Thank you. I think I saw another hand over here. Was it one? Was it somebody, I thought? Anyone else would like to say or comment on the history education piece or anything else so far? Is it interesting? Is it quiet? Is it unfamiliar?
No, we want to move to human rights education.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, me too. I always want to move to human rights education. I only have one slide. I was trying to restrain myself. Well, the best example I found of this actually is South Africa. Partly I say the best example because they actually called it that. And I have here in your handouts, thinking that you might be interested more in that, an excerpt from the curriculum statement for grades R through 9. I'm just going to focus on the human rights education piece, but I wanted to say before I step into that, there was so much going on in South Africa. You know, infusion of indigenous people's knowledge, history education reform. It was amazing. So, as you know, human rights was the discourse, and the new political elites brought it with them. You had the Human Rights Commission given authority to review all curriculum reforms through something called the Working Group on Human Rights and Inclusivity. This happened about 5 years after, like 1999 or so. This was remarkable. The deputy director of the commission was actually seconded to the Ministry of Education to work on human rights education. It wasn't just that there was a commission here and it was the Department of Education there. There was actually a physical person who was given the authority to oversee, to make sure that there would be reforms implemented that reflected human rights values, and to oversee any reforms to make sure they weren't in opposition to human rights values. This was an incredible undertaking. So eventually, I'm making this story shorter, there was a working group on human rights and inclusivity that was established. It was a group that included 3 people from the commission and 3 other kind of experts. At some point, just moving ahead, thinking about actors, within the Department of Education, they established a unit on race, values, and social cohesion, which exists to this day. So in terms of institutional commitment to human rights education, it was remarkable. But the processes were also incredible. The Working Group on Human Rights and Inclusivity actually worked with over 100 working groups of educators, teachers from schools, in groups assigned to the different learning programs and courses in South Africa. Math teachers, science teachers. Every subject at every level was reviewed, and recommendations were made for how to infuse human rights values inside of them. You can imagine that what preceded this were guidelines about what would that look like in science, what would that look like in math, and so forth. There was a lot of support for these working groups and building their capacity around this. I've also made an allusion here, and the document I gave you goes into much more detail. What do you mean by human rights? Again, because we know this can be very general and very conceptual, so they got very specific. Even this isn't enough detail here, but they wanted to include issues that are related to anti-sexism, anti-racism, environmental rights, diversity, and so forth. So they put a lot under human rights, even though I have it here as a single list. And that was all negotiation. If you look here on this handout here, this was what I was interested in. They actually had a manifesto on values, education, and democracy. It's important to note that I guess it was around 2002 or 2003, there was a new Minister of Education. That was the person who started this unit on race, values, and social cohesion, who was a constitutional lawyer. And this South African constitutional lawyer who'd worked on the South African Constitution came to the Ministry of Education with the idea to really push it even further. We'd already had the South African Human Rights Commission through the working group working on human rights and inclusivity, but the lawyer came with really wanting to push human rights even further. So it was I think it must have been 2001. So the unit was established, and there was another kind of revitalization of this effort. But you can see here, there's actually a manifesto from the Department of Ed listing these principles. And then also look at these 16 strategies. It goes on and on. So you can see there was no lack of good thinking about what human rights would look like in schools, not only in terms of content and ways of teaching, but real issues in South African society that could be addressed in some ways through the various subjects. So it was an incredibly well-organized effort. There was commitment at the levels you would hope to see at the central level. It was also very inclusive in the sense that you had over 100 working groups with teachers and educators giving input, and at the end of it, very sobering results. I spoke with the person who had been in charge of this effort on the Human Rights Commission, and it was a constant struggle. The struggle was, the backside was the Ministry of Education wanted to control the curriculum reform process, even though they had been given the authority to oversee it here, and they were giving all these recommendations. Not surprisingly, the Ministry of Education saw it as their job. So they did take into account recommendations coming from these groups, but they didn't necessarily implement them. One of the recommendations, as I have here in the second point, was to have a separate learning program and life orientations. Learning program is like a kind of cluster under which there are different courses. This is what they call it in South Africa. This was rejected, but they had thought, okay, well, it's like the idea of having a separate course, except it wasn't a course, it was a cluster. So that was rejected, so they ended up having more the transversal or cross-curricular or infusion approach. And again, a lot of it ended up not being accepted. And the reasons, and the way that my colleague explained it is that it often got reduced, the human rights values, just to legalistic terms, to just the sheer concepts, as opposed to this much deeper and sort of more socially relevant interpretation, which they had actually made recommendations about. So it wasn't only that, it was like they had the Ministry of Education decision makers actively actually rejected many of the recommendations. So there was a minimalist approach. That's how they put it. In fact, some of the people involved in this have written a couple of articles about it, and it was disappointing because they felt like the ultimate explanation for why the human rights tended to be rendered to primarily kind of values or legalistic renderings was that the Ministry of Education people never embraced human rights education as a pedagogy, which is the idea of critical pedagogy, or this idea that it should be relating to everyday issues. supporting the empowerment of learners is one of the language that you hear, to really address issues of problems in the schools. If you look at the manifesto and you see they're looking at arts and culture, they're recognizing the importance of the hidden curriculum, they want to promote history. By the way, it was contested in South Africa. Should we be looking at history? I jumped to the history education reforms in South Africa, but there was a period of time where they actually had to justify looking at history education as part of the TJ processes, just to say that. Looking at sports to nurture nation building at schools, equal access to education. You can see they were so ambitious. There was no lack of ideas. So I haven't interviewed anybody from the Ministry of Education, but it would be very interesting to hear their point of view about why they did not accept some of these ideas. And my guess is that it's no lack of ill will. I think it probably is a lot of the explanation would be business as usual, like we only have so much time, we already have a very full curriculum, we can put in a sentence here or there, but we can't really add another lesson, So these were some of the results from South Africa, which were very interesting, and I'm happy to speak more generally about human rights education reform in TJ environments, because that's been a lot of my work, but I just studied this recently, and I think the processes were interesting too, so maybe I'll stop there and let's just have open discussion and questions for the rest. And those of you who do have experience, by all means share them. This is, a lot of you have, this is a peer learning environment. It's just not me sharing my own points of view. Yeah. I think there's someone behind you had your hand up, and then
It seems like on this list, it seems like the widest one in a sense is ensuring that every South African is able to read and write and count and think. If you go to the Ministry of Education, maybe that's what you should ask them. Is this your goal? Are you furthering it? Are more South Africans today able to read, write, count, and think than were able to during apartheid? And if not, how might that happen? For crying out loud, that's what the Ministry of Education is in business to be doing.
that's right. I think that it ended up in this particular document because the right to education is language that's used, is still used in South Africa, and so they didn't want to overlook making that point, but there were people that were aware of that. That's, and it's still an issue, of course, in South Africa, but yeah, that's very basic, and indeed. But they weren't the only carriers of that message, but yeah, it's pretty basic.
So I had a question, perhaps more generally, which is that I seem to see a tension between the national creation of these curricula and the local implementation. Because depending on the context of the school, students may see this discourse, but without a commensurate change in social policy, they might not begin to believe it. And so how do you adapt human rights education, I suppose? Mm-hmm. When you're talking about social justice and equity, or non-racism and non-sexism, that's eminently pervasive in South Africa, in many communities, and so these kids are gonna have a hard time believing in it. So how do you kind of
that's a good
adapt
point.
to local context without allowing the Colombian system where local schools can just eliminate any sort of
I think that those of us in human rights education feel like that the answer is something called critical pedagogy, which is an approach which really has you looking critically at your society. And just having those discussions about these issues in the classroom, when they may never be discussed in classes, is progress. It's not the solution per se, but it's a progress. So if you don't have critical pedagogy, if you're not looking at those social issues as they really are, then your head's in the sand in the schooling sector. And so that's the failure to have critical pedagogy as central to human rights education is a failure of human rights education. So that is part of the disappointment here that my colleague felt, because if you are considering human rights education as only content, it's not human rights education, it's education about human rights, but it's not education like for human rights, or it's not education through human rights, as they say. Education through human rights is the pedagogy, education for is activism. So the other piece of it is that civic education, we can learn from comparative studies on civic education, because civic education has similar agendas in terms of active learning and engagement in community, and increasingly, actually, civic education and the people studying it are looking beyond the traditional forms of political involvement like voting towards basically, activism and engagement in the community and in other ways. And what those studies have shown consistently over the last 20 years is that these ingredients of dialogue in the classroom, which is not even as deep as, say, critical pedagogy, is fundamental for seeing students really interested in engagement or active, or even aware of issues and the ways you might want them to be if they're active citizens. And those studies have also shown that, for example, in Mexico, you may have language in the curriculum for civics that's very active-oriented and that looks beautiful, and yet if you, in these studies, the young people are cynical about Mexican institutions, and they don't trust them, but they might be active in their communities. The young people might be active in their communities, but they don't have trust in institutions. So there's lots to look at there, and there's other people have looked more closely at it, but one of the observations has been that the failure to really look at school level change is a complete mistake. Whether if you have a curriculum reform with all the right language and even the language around pedagogy, but if you don't support classroom change, if you don't change the culture of the schools, you're not going to be successful. It's just going to be on paper, and that's what they're realizing more and more. And that is a challenge. Is that if you're in a decentralized system or a centralized system, how do you reach the teachers? How do you get to the schools? How do you convince the teachers to undertake it? Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the question of kind of when and where do you get this, history and teach education reform, and particularly the connection between the existence and multiple use of transitional justice mechanisms and curriculum reform. You sort of hinted at me, said when you have unresolved TJ issues in society, it's hard to get curriculum reform because society itself has no consensus on it. And I actually kind of, I haven't done research on this. I'm more in a personal experience of having both my boys in school twice in Argentina. So seeing the textbooks that the kids brought home from school at 2 different grade levels at 2 different moments. And the Argentines were doing amazing work. I mean, the 3rd grader came home, and they weren't teaching the 3rd grader about the disappeared. They were teaching the 3rd grader about the rights of the child. Mm-hmm. Right? They really taught kind of the appropriate level for that age. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, eventually you were getting about the disappeared and about the dictatorship, and it was because they could cite their own Truth Commission and their own prosecutions, the trials of the juntas, and so they could cite to national institutions that had arrived at certain conclusions about what happened.
Those, it might have been much more complicated.
No, they wouldn't have addressed it.
So the Uruguayans, who had not had that yet, simply had not done anything with their textbooks, and not only that, people said that basically what the teachers did was they just never got to the dictatorship. Yeah. And we have that little here too, how you never get past the Civil War in U.S. history courses. But it really occurred to me that you need an authoritative national source in order to incorporate into a textbook. And so if you haven't had a Truth Commission, if you haven't had prosecutions that have created this authoritative national source, it's very hard to create textbooks.
If you want collective history. And the intermediary, I would say, is, for example, what Columbia is doing, where they're just documenting different experiences. But that's not going to turn into a collective history. But you're absolutely right. It has to be worked out. Otherwise, you don't teach it. Even in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where they now have these history standards, I mean, I looked at what they had. It goes right up to 1992, then it stops. Right. Yeah. And they can't go further. And I don't know how long that's going to be before they can address it. So it's very wise. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a surprise.
I'm just to close on what Catherine just said, I think another very interesting case is Sierra Leone, because the Truth Commission there actually made a child readable version of the report. So I think that can be one of the examples of national sources that can be relevant in this sense.
That's great. Knowing that it is at the lowest common denominator that it needs to be implemented, teachers and the community, I was just wondering whether UNESCO has some efforts with transitional justice and human rights education. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have the mandate and what they are doing. And then, of course, what in the regional organizations such as, when you have the Council of Europe, but the European Union, and there again, there is no particular mandate for education as such, but There is, of course, a need for it, and of course that is running into problem that you have the decentralization of education, not just within the European Union 28 member states, but also within the individual states, like Germany. It's decentralized. So how do we deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, UNESCO is active in this area. Of course, they come at the invitation of the ministries of education.
Yeah.
I think although their mandate includes human rights education, my experience with them is that if they're doing any kind of normative work in a post-conflict environment, they're calling peace education is what they call it, because it's neutral.
Right.
And what that looks like will depend on where they're working, because even peace education is very, very broad. So, and they have, the IBE is in Geneva, and they have curriculum, developers there. They also have experts in the regional offices, so they absolutely work with ministries who are interested in curriculum reform. I mean, the OSCE does that as well. Actually, the OSCE is more involved in human rights education because I've worked with them, because that's their mandate is human rights.
Right.
So they can come in and literally work with, like I think they were working in Kyrgyzstan now with the paid secondary, tertiary, and level reforms oriented around human rights content and values. For whatever reasons, they're doing that now there. So absolutely, the UN agencies can come in, and they have their own manuals, and not to be used in classrooms directly, but guides for how to develop it. But they also have experts that ministries can retain to do that work. So they're definitely actors in this.
Thank you.
Sure. I think the High Commissioner for Human Rights can sometimes do it too in the region.
Yeah.
But I think UNESCO's more
Technical
often.
assistance area.
Yeah.
When you've been brought in to be a consultant in some of these processes, do you often end up working much with locals, or are you kind of working at a higher level so that you don't actually come in contact with these kind of sources of resistance or difficulties in implementation?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think what would be the best example to use. Well, this reminds me, actually, what I'm working on now, because this reminds me of the process, I'm actually working on a publication, a resource guide. We're not sure what it's called, a resource handbook maybe, that I'm working on for UNESCO, OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the Organization of American States on how to do curriculum reform for education for democratic citizenship and human rights education, because we do have very diverse experiences in different systems, and let's put it on paper with examples. And part of the reason I wanted to do that, which is why I'm thinking of it since you asked me, is because I really wanted to encourage more grassroots involvement and teacher involvement and youth involvement in these processes, which do tend to be very top-down and expert-oriented. So that's part of my hidden reason for doing it. So I'm actually working on that resource now. So typically in curriculum reform efforts, you do have ministries of education. By the way, they're usually doing curriculum reform. I mean, this is normal for them. They're looking at their civics, they're looking at their science and their math, they're taking a look at textbook revisions every few years. It's normal anyway, so they've got cycles of this. But you might be doing a massive education reform, which means you're going to try to think differently about, like, you might be looking at the big picture, like what kind of high school student do we want graduating from this system, which might give you a kind of meta ideas about skills you want your graduates to be having in when they go out in society as citizens, for example, or workers, or all these identities, and underneath that various syllabi and so forth. And those kinds of processes are well defined by ministries of education. There's a unit that oversees it. They have different stakeholders involved. I mean, you can have a core decision-making group, which is going to probably include somebody from, like the minister or the deputy minister of education, somebody from the board of education, maybe a policy maker. You've got these really high-level people who are not involved in the technical work but have to sign off on it. Then you've got more of a technical committee, which are the doers, who are typically in the Ministry of Education, but they might have someone from higher education who's also a textbook writer. They might have somebody from UNESCO if they're involved in it in some ways. They might have someone from the teacher training department as well as somebody in textbook writing. So they have those, and they're together thinking more technically about the work. And then they have reference groups, which would be typically at the teacher level. So you have, the teachers that have been piloting in the past, and you have them from different parts of the country, gender balance, if you can get that. Most of the times it is women, but you try to get some gender balance or other kinds of diversity, and you bring them in, not usually to write, which is a criticism I have, but to review and to pilot. And one of the questions I have about this is how much actually gets changed. So you have these very different levels. There are ways in which teachers can be involved, but they're not usually, and then you also have, when you're working on a high-level curriculum reform, you have various workshops, like it's called a stakeholders meeting, where you basically roll out your thinking. You might have 40 people there for half a day, and they're people from the community. They're really diverse. They're not just educators, and it's just usually it's just informing and not really consulting. So I do think there isn't enough of the grassroots consultations. Columbia did it really well because it was a decentralized system, and they had to kind of sell it. I mean, they actually put the civic competencies in the newspapers for people to look at and comment. That was how they used it. They had to generate, carry out public awareness to basically convince schools that it was important to undertake it. But there isn't enough of that. I mean, surprisingly. I mean, youth don't get consulted. It's amazing. It's really seen as technical. So that's something that really it's not really often that it really is more grassroots. I'm really leaning hard on the Columbia example in this resource because I like that they did so much, and there aren't many examples of it. But these processes are already sort of in place. And then when you do have like a funder coming in, then maybe you have another group where all the funders are together because somebody's working on vocational education, someone's doing teacher training, someone's doing this textbook. And mind you also have textbook writers in these countries. They have their own. Countries have different ways of organizing textbook writing. Is this interesting, or is this?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask a question about textbook production. So maybe I can ask it, then you can continue on that.
Great.
And that is, one big issue, the centralization issue, is that you have very different kinds of countries. At least some countries. In the old days, Mexico had one history book for every grade level.
Right.
And so no wonder they're cynics. Of course, it is the official history by definition, right? It seems to me, so have we gotten rid of that model?
Yeah.
That the administrative education chooses the one history?
Yeah.
Then you have this extremely decentralized cases like the Columbia, but like the United States, we should point out as well. Where there's
Not at the school level, but at the state level. Yeah.
well, even more so in the United States. No, I mean it's often at the school level. The standards are at the state level, but the textbooks are at the school level.
Oh, the textbooks are, They're authorized with the textbook. Yeah, you have choices. You have a list and you can choose.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then you have this intermediate one, which is what the Argentina one was, is that there's multiple textbooks, but it's a small country, so there may be 3-4 textbooks available for any one for any one grade level, right? But then you have at least the possibility that people can really pick and choose between ones that are are better or not. So I guess I just wondered, given those different there's very what happens with textbook production in those very different models?
That's a good question. So in many of these countries that has been highly centralized, there's one textbook per course, per grade, and obviously that means there's a lot of control about what happens in terms of teaching and learning process, especially when it's very textbook driven. Because, by the way, as an aside, culture in classrooms around how much you use textbooks will vary. Some cultures, some schools are very textbook centered. You put a textbook in a teacher's hand, they're teaching from the textbook. It's not always the case. I mean, there are places where, like in Cuba, for example, where teachers are really encouraged to draw on multiple resources, even if there is a textbook. I mean, this is as an aside, but they may be developing their own lessons. So just to say, the culture around using textbooks will also vary. But this idea of the market for textbook is super important. And often in these environments, right, in a transitional justice period, organizations like the World Bank comes in and they want there to be multiple textbooks so there's choices, and they fund that happening. And so that's one of the things that usually gets opened up, so that there's going to be more choices. So that's true. And then you still might have a Ministry of Education has to approve of the textbooks being offered, but they don't necessarily require that certain textbooks be used, per se. The Ministry of Education might also authorize or say nothing about NGOs and all their work in schools, because NGOs often come in with their own supplemental materials and teacher training manuals, not usually pupil textbooks. One of the things to be aware of is in countries where they do provide textbooks, they're often providing pupil textbooks, but not the teacher manuals. Internationals will come in with teacher manuals, so they can help teachers like teach in a different way, but it's usually only the ministry that can really afford to actually put out the pupil textbooks. So whether or not those pupil textbooks, if there's more than one choice, is pretty important, and it's a lot of money potentially. I mean, in terms of like, you know, who produces those who pays, who buys them. This question also of who buys the textbook is an issue. Like in Kosovo, right after I worked a lot, right after the changes, they opened up the textbook market so that there would be choice. You know, that there would be choice. But the ministry couldn't afford to produce multiple textbooks for pupils, and you know, so the parents had to buy the textbooks for their children, and they couldn't afford it. So the ministry actually, when I went back there to work a few years ago, had decided to go back to one textbook per grade per course, because they didn't want parents to be disadvantaged in having choices for buying textbooks for their children because they didn't have money. So I'd never seen that happen before. So this issue of whether there are choices is really important. Money comes into play then, as you can imagine, because they're really expensive. The issue of whether textbooks stay with schools, they go home with the pupils, also really important. Those varies by culture. And the other thing that has come up as well around textbooks is who writes them and how that gets chosen. So what you have, I alluded to guidelines for history textbook with Bosnia and Herzegovina. So these guidelines are important also to be established if you're going to have more than one kind of textbook produced, which is probably the ideal. We want more choices. So what does it look like to have, you know, textbooks that are reflecting these kinds of values? I worked on a textbook reform project in Morocco. I didn't actually do the reform, but we did a gender-based textbook review with civil society, the Ministry of Education, with civil society organizations, mostly women's human rights groups, but also parent associations. And we went back and looked at the textbooks to see, you know, representation of girls and women as authors and the language that represented them in stereotyping, and the outcome was guidelines. So moving forward, when the Moroccan Ministry of Education looked at textbooks to approve or disapprove, or giving out guidelines for writers, because they usually issue basically proposals. We need a textbook for 7th grade in, you know, whatever it is, world history or Albanian history. And they have to have very specific things. They want this content in it. They want these kinds of, you know, these frames addressed, and we want also maybe gender inclusion or these other values. So the ministry still could basically issue those kinds of, I don't know, tenders, and or they have frames, or they have to have frames for approving them. On the one hand, if they're commissioning textbooks and they have to choose them, they have very clear guidelines. On the other hand, if it's more of a marketplace and they have to approve, they still have to have guidelines for approval that probably look fairly similar. So it's really important indeed how that happens. And just to keep in mind, for those of you who are interested in this topic, Council of Europe and other UN agencies, or even the NGO that I worked with, if we didn't do anything in the education system around education, it typically was only a teacher's manual. So it was still really much relying on the manual and, you know, educating, teacher trainings, and the teacher would have to basically implement it in their own way. But that's not pupil textbooks, and that's really different. Yeah. Did that answer your question sufficiently?
Yes,
okay.
I hope this doesn't, I hope people don't see this as a change of subject. In my mind, it's not, but
Okay.
it may come across.
Doesn't
as
matter,
change of
just
subject.
ask.
The comment was made about, you know, in the U.S. never getting beyond teaching the Civil War, and it occurred to me, there's something I've wondered. A lot of Americans are famous for really not knowing or caring much about history in general, whether it's their own history, whether it's world history. Americans are, you know, famous for sort of moving ahead. Henry Ford saying history is bunk. What matters is how you move ahead and so forth and so on. And I'm just wondering, when people teach history, especially after transitional or in a transitional justice period, they are teaching history of conflict for the most part, right? And conflict on their own soil, conflict that happened to them or to their society. And is that sort of, I mean, are Americans then complacent because it was 1865 the last time people died on our soil? Is that part of Americans' sort of lack of engagement with history, in the sense that, you know, like one's history becomes one's identity, yes? Mm-hmm. And so you've got people in places who actually remember, whose parents actually remember dying and disappearing and so forth. And then you have Americans, what do we remember, you know, money making. Is that a fair generalization to make, that with complacency, or with lack of conflict, personal conflict, comes complacency?
Oh, I hear different things, but I invite anyone to respond. I mean, I think you're alluding to is meta narrative for countries and identity around conflict, and I guess that's an assumption you're making, and I'm not sure that that's. I would say that's incomplete. But I do think, and what I hear you saying is that as someone who's working in human rights education, and I teach a lot of teachers who are interested in peace education, there can be seen as an overemphasis on conflict in history and a failure to capture other kinds of national histories that could be seen as more constructive and positive. So that is a separate point, but that I think that I have heard that, and I would generally agree with that personally. You could say the same for museums. So I do think that's true. I'm not sure how that particular point relates to people's disinterest in history or lack of interest in history in the United States. I can't address that particular view, but those elements of what you've just mentioned, that's my response to that. But perhaps someone else has a point of view about this, especially any Americans that may have gone through the U.S. schooling system.
I'm sure it's a different experience in different parts of the United States just because it's such a big country. But I went through public school in Georgia, so sometimes even just getting to the Civil War did prompt some controversy.
There are folks who are still living it.
And we had an incident in my classroom in high school when we were doing American history where we made it to like the 20th century, and we were assigned different projects to focus on different aspects of history, and one student was assigned the civil rights movement, and he got very upset because he had been assigned not real history, and our African American history teacher disagreed with him. So I think there are still some processes that are still fresh enough here that maybe just depending on where you are, they are still kind of sensitive.
Your question, was it partly answered, your question?
Yeah, I guess I didn't quite understand what you meant when you said that the analysis was incomplete.
Well, national identity in history, and it's partly based on a conflict, I suppose, and war and victory or loss, as the case may be, but not only. Constitutionalism.
Can you give some examples out of the countries that you've worked in? Sort of how it is that, whether it's differing versions of history or whether it's Mexico's one and only version.
You mean in terms of conflict?
Sort of, let's take Mexico and then let's take Bosnia and Herzegovina as sort of opposite examples. So when you have one and only one version of history, what kind of Mexican do you produce? And when you have completely he said, she said kinds of narratives, what kind of Bosnian or Herzegovina or Soviet?
I actually haven't worked in history reform. I've done more the education for democratic citizenship and human rights education. Mm-hmm. So I actually can't speak to that from my own experience. I was brought in, ironically enough, to do the history education work in Bosnia and Herzegovina because I was not a history educator. They felt that I would make it more complicated if I had a point of view. So, believe it or not. So I actually can't speak to that, I'm sorry. I do know when I was looking at the standards for Bosnia and Herzegovina that they were standards. I wasn't looking at textbooks, but it was the presentation of, well, it wasn't, history is not just conflict, obviously. It's also coexistence, it's geography, it's boundaries, it's language and culture, it's what you look at if you look up when there was an encyclopedia on your shelf, it's the kind of, information you find about those kinds of facts, if you will. Legislative rulers. I'm sorry I can't answer your question. But I can try to find maybe some articles that might help. I think you're asking about I can tell you about techniques. Like sometimes just because I'm thinking of it now, but like there are attempts when there is not this idea also that there are regions that have shared histories. Some boundaries have changed, and they may be discrete now. There may be different countries, but they have shared histories. Also shared histories maybe of discrimination or colonization. So Southeast Asia, they've been working on, Southeastern Europe, they've been working on, they being an NGO, has been working with like-minded NGOs international in the region to develop a kind of regional history textbook. They did the same also in the Baltics. I think not authorized by the Ministry of Education, talking about history textbooks, not forbidden. That's something in between. I'm just saying that. That doesn't really get at your topic exactly, but I'm just saying that there are different strategies to deal with this issue of multiple perspectives, even that go beyond the boundaries of the borders per se.
Just the last
Question, last word.
We are getting to 60 years after World War II.
Yeah.
And I was in school pretty much afterwards. And coming back to the teachers, even if you don't have your history books, I think it is very much also depending on how much teachers have courage and have initiatives to bring stories into the classrooms. I remember, I think I was in 4th or 5th grade, he read to us about Auschwitz and we discussed it at home. And it was existing in some other places, but otherwise in Germany it took decades until the official history books were rewritten.
Yeah.
That's
I think
what
about
we're-
30 to 40
That would have been in the
decades.
1950s, and it didn't
Yes.
come into the curriculum officially until the 1960s.
That's right, late
Wow.
60s.
Right. Well, Felisa, thank you very
Yes,
much. This was
it was
a
great.
fascinating
Good, I'm glad you liked it.